I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And we are Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshet Podcasts. Jonathan, maybe for this episode, we'll just switch to Holy instead of our familiar title.
Guilt-ridden. We must drop anything that sounds sacrilegious because we are in the, what are we on? We're on sort of day 9 or day 8 as we talk of the 10 days of penitence and atonement and repentance. And the big one, Yom Kippur, the big day itself, Judgment Day, is very nearly upon us. So you're right. Best behavior.
Exactly. So best behavior for our Yom Kippur episode, our fast episode, if you will, or fast. It depends.
I would say fast. Yes, gosh, yes, you're right. It sounded so ridiculous when you said it. I thought, of course, I wouldn't say that, but yes, that is what I say. We're about to fast long A, and so yes, I just thought we both thought it would be nice just to sort of check in before we all disappear in a world of. I mean, I don't know how you do it. I'm quite hardcore on this. No screens, no phones, no devices. In fact, I've just had a big discussion with my kids about how rigorously I'm going to enforce the no screens, no gadgets, no phones rule. And I'm hardcore on that. I think it's 25 hours where you sort of retreat from modernity is how I see it. I want it to be a bit timeless and a bit ancient.
I surprisingly see it the exact same way as you do.
That is surprising. Go on.
I know.
How do you enforce it?
No, not in my household. I mean, in general, but when you have very small children on Yom Kippur and half of the parents in the household are not fasting, so there's a kind of difference between the different aspects of the family. But the parts of us who are fasting, i.e., me, are in fact going to enforce that rule on themselves.
So I'm a bit intrigued by kind of who fasts and who doesn't. So here I was going to say in Britain, but maybe in diaspora, I think lots of people who have almost no link anymore with the religion, or even in many cases the culture or the community, that's the last thing to go. They hold on to that. So people who could not explain it in any kind of religious or belief kind of way, nevertheless fast out of sort of solidarity with other Jews. And, crudely, almost ancestor worship. My parents did, my grandparents, great-grandparents, so I'm going to fast. So you see all kinds of people who really, probably wouldn't know one end of a prayer book from the other and wouldn't subscribe to any kind of doctrinal beliefs, will nevertheless withhold from eating or drinking for Yom Kippur. My assumption always was you kind of need to do that in diaspora because how else do you identify with your fellow Jews? My guess and assumption was in Israel, why do you even, apart from people who are capital R religious, why would anybody fast?
Well, first of all, 60% of the population, the Jewish population in Israel, fasts on Yom Kippur. That's more than would consider themselves religious in any way. And I think it ties into what you said completely. I mean, in the fact that this is a relic of our religion, and it's important for even people who don't practice, who are usually secular. So indeed, there are a lot of people who do go through this, and we will soon, I think, give our tips for fasting. It's important, Jonathan. What have you accumulated over the years?
No, I will come to those, and I'm big on those. So
really, maybe you can teach me something.
Before we leave that though, because this is something I'm going to ask again on behalf of my kids. I have told them, based on my hazy memories, because I've been in Israel once on Yom Kippur, that it's the time when kids can be seen cycling on what we would here call the motorway. Americans would call the freeway, but the big fast roads where normally you'd be risking your neck if you went on a little push bike. But the roads are empty and people cycle. Is that the truth, or have I spun my kids another urban myth?
No. First of all, you have to say the country kind of shuts down. The only country that shuts down completely, right? No entertainment centers or malls or restaurants or cars or anything. No television, not even the news. But there is a difference in Israel. You kind of have to say that between the religious parts of the country where people go to synagogue, et cetera, and the more kind of secular areas where, as you said, roads are completely empty. So you have, bikes and rollerblades taking over the world, and indeed in the highways as well.
Yeah. See, the big difference here, of course, is that there is no difference
for
everybody. It's a normal day. And so growing up, the thing I used to find tricky, particularly on Kol Nidre, actually, in the evening, which is if you're beginning your fast, you're new to fasting, that you're a teenager, you're already starving by 9 o'clock in the evening. You're convinced yourself that this is a starvation thing. And we would walk back from the synagogue, past the kind of pizza places and the fish and chip shops, which, because it's not Israel, were all open. And you'd be getting the scents and the smells and thinking, I'm really, really hungry. And then the next day, when you'd go, now where I live, you'll go past the kind of crunchy organic bakery, beautiful smells of coffee roast and sort of sourdough bread. And again, it's like some kind of torture. And you are very, very clearly aware then that, oh yeah, we are a minority here. This is diaspora life. Nobody else knows it's Yom Kippur, and you're in your own kind of bubble.
Yeah. Well, last year here, at least, we also were in lockdown during high holidays. And even before that, there were months of lockdown. So the kind of national joke was, Yom Kippur is no difference. It's no different. It's the same thing, right? We're just not eating. Yeah. But also, I think another thing that you should kind of think of when you think of Israel during Yom Kippur is that, since 1973, obviously, there's been an extra layer of significance in Israel, right? The Yom Kippur War and the surprise attack by Egypt and Syria against Israel. That is really the biggest trauma Israelis suffered till that point. So that is also something that kind of lingers in your mind on that day. Obviously, they completely changed Israel and started this era of,
You remind me of something which actually, because I was 6, I know you were like minus 26 then, but I was 6. And I have the most
trying to get in the good books, right, Jonathan?
I'm trying
to get in the good book.
I have the dimmest possible memory of that, but the memory I have was that in the synagogue, the Epicurus was king that day. In other words, the non-practicing Jew who had the radio on when they went home and could update the rest of the congregation on what was happening in Israel. Even the rabbi then was prepared to turn a very blind eye to the fact that some people had put the TV on or had put the radio on. And in fact, as I say, they were elevated to the honored position in the congregation. And thereafter, I was always convinced that the community needed at least one person who had their ear just across the news, just in case there was a repeat of the 1973 experience, heaven forbid. So yes, fasting tips. So what are yours?
They're not very original, but
That's okay.
and I don't want to ruin anyone's diet or anything.
Not judging. Dare judgment, but there's no human judgment, so I'm not judging.
A lot of carbs and a lot of water. That's the whole thing. I have nothing. I don't have anything smarter to say.
So your last meal before fasting will be pasta or something.
Water and potatoes.
Basically, water and potatoes.
Yes.
Very good. Okay, so I don't know yet what. Often it's been a traditional kind of, Ashkenazi Friday night meal with chicken and potatoes and all that. Every year I think this is very bad because it's salt and all that. Every year, and it is elevated now to the status of sort of holy minhag or custom. Every year, I will say at the table, Papa, my father's friend, Morris Davis, always fasts on 2 boiled eggs. And the kids around the table will go, maybe we should do that one year. And I'll go, maybe next year. And that is now elevated to tradition. Morris Davis, a very close friend from Luton, where my father grew up, fasts on not 1, but 2 boiled eggs and nothing else, crucially.
Are you sure about that? It sounds like an urban legend.
Well, I wonder. It's one of those things we journalists have, stories that are too good to check. I don't really want to check that one. But he would fast on 2 boiled eggs. The other bit I picked up when I lived in Washington was from people in DC used to fast on whatever they ate. They would drink Gatorade. You across the Gatorade thing?
We don't do that in Israel. I know what that is, but why? Because it's like sugary and
they would claim there was some kind of scientific electrolyte thing in there. And you would see all these, knitted kippah wearing DC people drinking this kind of electric blue liquid that, their lips and their tongues would be bright blue afterwards because Gatorade is so kind of vivid with chemicals. But they claimed that was really good for fasting. So there we are.
Yeah, we need to say that we're not going to do Chutzpah and Mensch this episode, Jonathan, because, we're going to go back to keeping tabs after the book is sealed and signed, I think.
We don't want to be judgmental. That's our thing, isn't it? So we're not going to get ourselves in trouble by judging people harshly, which is what our Chutzpah award normally entails. It's a bit of loshing, as you will hear, which is the anglicized version of Lashon Hara, bitching about people, evil tongue. So we're not going to do it. We could do mensch, but we're not even going to do that because we don't want to play.
As careful as possible, right. We just want to play as careful. But what are we going to do instead then?
Well, I thought it would be, and we talked about this before, we saved it for the podcast, in fact. Before we get to that, we have to talk about what we've both been doing this week because you've had a very busy day, Yonit Levy, and I want you to tell us who it is you've been speaking to just before you started talking to me.
Well, I interviewed the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, Naftali Bennett, who became Prime Minister exactly 3 months and 1 day ago. Let's say a very different experience compared to interviewing Netanyahu, who had his own fallout with the mainstream media in Israel since about 2015, never gave interviews unless it was in a campaign and he wanted to use the mainstream media's ratings. So Naftali Bennett gave an interview, and I think the most interesting thing that he said, really, because there's this question, I think we all kind of ask ourselves, not only inside Israel, but outside, who are you? Who are you, Naftali Bennett? You used to be a politician, this hardliner from the right who would attack Netanyahu all the time, trying to pull him more to the right. And now you started an unexpected coalition with people from the left and from the center and for the first time an Arab party. So what are your views and what are your ideologies? And he gave his own version. Remember, we talked about Ariel Sharon, who spoke about the things you see from opposition are not the things you see from the prime minister's office. And he was the architect of the settlements who became the architect of the dismantling the settlements. So Naftali Bennett gave his own version of that. And he said, when I asked him again and again about the sort of discrepancy and the things that he used to say in his policy now, and he said, when I enter the prime minister's office, I essentially throw away the politician I was, which I thought was a very interesting thing to say.
You've obviously interviewed him lots of times before, but not as prime minister.
True.
I'm interested just because the mechanics of the news business interest me. Did he do this live, sitting on your set on your show, or did you go and see him earlier today?
No, I went to see him earlier. Usually, that's what you do with the prime minister. Again, Netanyahu was the person who broke all the rules in that regard. But
because he sometimes would come on,
because he would
sit with you on the broadcast.
But he would give you the call like an hour before. He didn't like for the person who interviewed him to be very well prepared. He'd come, that was what he used to do in the last couple of years. This was a sit-down interview. It was live to tape earlier today.
Excellent. And I'm interested whether he is impressive as an interviewer. And this is not a political judgment. This is just whether someone is dexterous as doing this. And the reason I partly mention it, just to do my own little bit of name dropping,
which I was going to do for you.
Oh, go on, you do it for me. Go on.
Because I was not the only one with a big interview in the last 24 hours. Of course, you interviewed Hillary Clinton yesterday, who used to be the next president of the United States.
Well, I did ask her because third time's the charm. Joe Biden ran 3 times and now there's no age barrier. So I did ask her that. No, I did. And it's quite true. For a Guardian Live event, I interviewed Hillary Clinton, and it was via, like we're talking now, it was kind of via Zoom. But just one of the things, there is just a bit of political tradecraft, which is some politicians are very, very good at making sure that even when they don't answer, they get their message rather than your message. And it was just impressive to me because one of the things we talked about was she had said in an earlier interview, actually back in 2016, she had said, unless you haven't noticed, I'm not a natural politician, she had said, unlike my husband, unlike Barack Obama. And I said to her, well, what did you mean by that? Because did you really mean a kind of male natural politician? Because the kind of skills she went on to say about charisma and all this, I wondered if she had a kind of male template. And she was very interesting on that, saying, yeah, basically that is the template people have. And so I wondered on that score, how good is Naftali Bennett just at the kind of business of handling a big set piece interview with Israel's most terrifying interview?
He was, the interesting thing about him is that since he is still very new to this business of premiership, he was still very candid, which is great when you're the interviewer. You feel like there's still enough honesty and candor in what he's saying and how he's saying it. There's this long story about a soldier in Israel who was killed in Gaza. Naftali Bennett called up the family and he was very confused. He got the name wrong. It was a very bad story for him. And he apologized in this interview that he gave today. And that was really interesting. He did, because Israeli politicians don't, I would never imagine Netanyahu apologizing in a million years. Naftali Bennett himself would never apologize before entering the prime minister's office, but there was something about the apology today which was really heartfelt and very rare. So he still has that, I don't know if to call it inexperience, but trying to say, and I think he's right in doing that and saying, look, this government is an experiment. We hope it will work, but we don't know for sure. And I think that probably can speak as a message to a lot of Israelis, of course.
You mentioned the journey that Sharon made. Once you sit in this chair, you see the world differently. You were the one who predicted he was going to become prime minister. So I'm going to make you do another prediction. Can you see him doing that journey and going from Mr. Rightist agitator on Netanyahu's right flank, moving across the spectrum because of the perspective of being in that chair?
Because of the perspective and because of the kind of coalition that he needs to hold together, it sounded like that could happen. Yes. The difference, of course, is that Sharon had a lot of political clout when he made the moves that he made. Naftali Bennett, again, is a leader that became prime minister because of a series of unexpected events, and he has only 6 mandates. So that's a big problem for him. But it sounded, Jonathan, like he gave up his political base, which was the right, in this interview, and said, I'm going to try and find, the Israeli voter who votes in the center. And, of course, the relationship between Bennett and Netanyahu could fill a few books, if not Shakespearean tragedies. But, he never referred to him by name or even by title. He said, my predecessor. And they're supposed to actually meet because by Israeli law, the head of the opposition and the prime minister need to meet every month for the head of opposition to be updated. And he said, I extended the invitation, but he's not here. So that is a little bit of how interesting it was. I do want to go back to your interview with Hillary, which I actually watched, Jonathan, or at least the sort of 20 minutes at the ending after I came back from the news. And I always thought that the way you interview is a little bit like the way that Jeff Bridges acts, which means it's so seamless and elegant. And you had that point where you tried to kind of understand she said, I don't want to run again, I'm not going to run. But you said, but have you given up the desire? Which I thought was very interesting. I would say that I think the true answer is probably no. But I really loved the conversation, and especially the part when she turned to the geeky part of the audience, and I knew she was talking about me.
Yeah, I felt very seen when she said that. When she said about geeks. Loving the Jeff Bridges comparison. Obviously, that will keep me going for the 25 hours without food and water. Love that. Yes, I thought that was really interesting because she said, I've got no plan or intention, but what I'd asked her was, do you have no desire? And she didn't say, I have no desire. It is the last thing on God's earth I would ever do again, which is what on a human level, I would have thought she might feel, given how, bruising it was, and she's, into her 70s. You'd think she might say that, but she pointedly did not say that. No, and it was my favorite moment in it was when I asked her if she'd seen The White Lotus, where she is a point
recurring
of reference.
theme on our podcasts.
It's becoming a perennial theme, and I was just, you'll remember there's the episode where, the middle-aged CEO woman says, I admire Hillary Clinton so much, and her kind of woke student daughter rolls her eyes. And I asked her if she'd seen that and how she felt about being on one side of a generational divide. But it's there on the Guardian website, or it will be at the end of the week, so you can hear her answer to that. I was going to say that Yom Kippur being upon us, I myself will be in synagogue for big chunks of it, but not the whole 25 hours. There are periods where I'm not. And I don't know about you, but I kind of feel there's a Ben Gurion approach to Yom Kippur. We're told that David Ben Gurion would retreat to his, hut on Kibbutz Sde Boker and read. I always heard that he would read Greek philosophy. He'd read Aristotle or whatever, rather than, Jewish sources. But it's a day of reading. And so I think this may have come from you, since you're the geek of geeks, to have our own little unholy book club.
Wait, I'm taking back that we're not doing chutzpah words. I'm taking that whole thing back.
Geek is such a compliment in our world. But I thought you were going to, because you were
calling the kettle black.
Yes,
what?
We're both geeks. So what do we read on Yom Kippur? Because we couldn't possibly just have a schloff. We're going to have to sit there improving our minds. So go on, what are you going to be reading?
So I wanted to actually recommend two books to you, Jonathan, which I've already read. So
leaning into your geek identity.
Exactly. So the first one I wanted to recommend to you is, by the way, my niece bought this for me, which is very strange. She's just started college in New Jersey. It's like, how is this happening? She was a baby a minute ago, and now she's starting college, and she's buying me feminist books. So this is pretty amazing, and it's a nonfiction book, and it's called Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. And it is really interesting because it's by Caroline Perez. I think she's British. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the whole point of the book is really to say that there's no data about women. Because men in research everywhere, right, in the health system and in the workplace, in the public sphere, they are always the template, and the women are atypical. And in everywhere and in every place this happens. So women become invisible. And like one example, and I think one of the best examples, the fact that crash test dummies were always fit for the male body and not for the female body until less than a decade ago. So what happens is that women and the whole car and the way it is built have to sort of move as close as possible to the steering wheel. Thus, every crash is much more lethal for a woman than it is for a man. This is just one example out of hundreds of examples in this book. And I think it's really interesting.
I remember her talking about the way phones were designed as well, that they are for the span of a male hand, and even where the keys are, it works for a man, doesn't necessarily work for a woman. I had a nonfiction recommendation as well, which is Gordon Brown's 7 Ways to Change the World. Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister. Regular listeners may know I am something of an admirer of his, partly just because of the way he's handled being an ex-prime minister. While some of his colleagues have gone around the world making a very big fortune, he devotes himself to good works. And, he would approach Yom Kippur, I think, with some confidence. He would be, I think, confident he will be in the good books because he's the UN envoy on girls' education, and his current obsession is getting vaccines to the developing world, to poorer countries. He goes around, he still gets on the phone to world leaders and says, this is how much it will cost you, you've got to do it. And his book, 7 Ways to Change the World, the thing about him, he has this incredibly kind of capacious intellect. And so he's taken the 7 big problems, climate change, education, the economy, poverty, and really drilled into what actually needs to be done. And so it gets quite technical sometimes, but it's a really idealistic, and he is simultaneously idealistic and practical. It's a sort of inspiring book, I think. So 7 Ways to Change the World by Gordon Brown.
Nice. So fiction, are we going to recommend that as well? What do you think?
No, for fiction, I did actually say this on the podcast already, but it's just come out again now in paperback. And so I really want to give this book a push because I'm a fan of it. It is, I think, probably the best novel I've read of this year. It's The Passenger, which we talked about because it was written in the 1930s by a young German Jew. And the book was more or less forgotten and has been revived by a small publisher in Britain. And the paperbacks just come out. They're giving it their biggest ever print run. They really, really want this to be a big hit. And it is. It's like a sort of Alfred Hitchcock, John Buchan thriller, but it's set among German Jews on the eve of the Holocaust, and it has all that tension in it, and it's just brilliantly done. And the author died very young, Ulrich Boschwitz. He died very young, never got to see his book being a sensation as it has become nearly 80 years on. But it's a really gripping read. It was a bestseller here, and if you haven't read it yet, I think that would be a very good thing to get you through the 25 hours.
I will also recommend a book about World War II because why not? So it's one of my actually favorite books. It's called All the Light You Cannot See. I don't know if you read it, but if you haven't, I think you'll really like it. It's about, not giving too much away, story of a French girl and a German boy. Their stories kind of collide during, obviously, the German occupation of France. A lot of questions, maybe tying into our Yom Kippur theme about forgiveness, about compassion, exploring that question of how ordinary Germans could have acted the way they did. And of course, how all this has to do with radio waves and Jules Verne and creatures of earth and sky. I'm not going to, again, give away too much, but it is really a stunning book. And now, Jonathan, I thought I'd surprise you in the completely negating the spirit of Yom Kippur.
Wow, what's coming?
I don't know. In playing a game.
Ah, okay.
Which, I don't know. Maybe we should, I don't think you can play games on Yom Kippur. Maybe we should add Al Chet. I thought the game should be, how well do you add it to Al Chet? How well do you know your co-host? And we are on the topic of fiction. So I wanted to ask you 3 questions about your favorite authors. And I wrote the answers I thought you'd say.
Oh, wow,
beforehand.
this is going to be good. Okay.
This is my note. See, JF.
Yeah.
And I wrote the answers in here. And let's see. You want to play?
Well,
By the way,
play.
I also
Yes.
have 50 shekels in my pocket. So
I can see the 50
I'm kidding.
shekel
I'm
there.
kidding.
That's
Make
is
it
good.
interesting. So I'm going to ask 3 questions. Let's see. Your favorite Israeli author, fiction author, Jonathan.
Amos Oz.
Your favorite American fiction author?
Oh, that's
Drumroll.
hard. Philip Roth.
Your favorite British fiction author? Boris Johnson. I'm kidding. Yes?
And we can do any time, historical or...
Anything.
I'm just going to go with the first one I've thought of, partly because I want you to win. So I'm going to say George Orwell.
That's mine, by the way. Okay. Listen, this is my note. And these are the answers I wrote. I feel like I'm in the Eurovision. Favorite
You're
Israeli
the
I
votes
wrote.
of the Jerusalem jury.
Amos Oz. Favorite American, Philip Roth. I failed miserably in the favorite British. I cannot believe it. I wrote, and I even kind of cheated because I wrote Charles Dickens and John le Carré.
You know, I really could have said John le Carré.
So 2 out of 3.
No, I feel,
Ain't bad.
I second guessed myself because I wanted you to win, and therefore I thought you might say George Orwell, so I went for that, and that was bad psychology because I think John le Carré would really be there, actually. So I'm going to give you that. I think those 50 shekels are yours because actually they are quite
50
literally
shekels are still mine.
Well,
next year, by the way, we're going to play favorite Italian author, favorite Japanese author, and favorite playwright. Just so you know, because we're not.
Okay. I think I can get 2 of those 3. Playwright is going to fox me a little bit. But Philip Roth, how predictable, because 2 Jews on the news, how predictable that I would pick Philip Roth. That is, Ashkenazi Jewish man.
No, but you also told me that
50s.
you loved The Plot Against America. I was listening sometime when you talk, so
I'm kicking myself at John le Carré. You know, he has a new book coming up, a posthumous book. No, seriously,
really?
He does.
Okay.
He left 1 book behind, and that is coming, which I am so excited about reading. That is coming. It's called Silverview, and it will be published later this year. And, I will find an excuse to talk about that on the podcast.
I'm sure you will. I was oh, sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I was getting worried that we were soon going to have to be having to eat carbs and drink lots of water because Yom Kippur
and drink
is almost
Gatorade,
upon
and
us.
for some reason drink Gatorade. I hope not.
We need a
Thankfully,
scientist
we
to
can't
write
get Gatorade in Israel. I was thinking about this kind of season of reflection and introspection, and we kind of ask ourselves, how to be better and what did we do this year and our shortcomings. And tis a season of answers and questions, right? Especially in Israel. In Hebrew, the word answer is tshuva, which is also imbued with the meaning of repentance. And there's a line from a book, we're talking about books, so there's a line from a book that I love, I absolutely love. It is a science fiction book, Jonathan. I know that you're not a fan of the genre, but it's Ursula Le Guin's book, The Left Hand of Darkness. And there's this quote that I absolutely love. There are fortune tellers and a protagonist that meets them. And they tell him why they became fortune tellers. And they say it's to exhibit the perfect uselessness of knowing the answer to the wrong question. And I thought about this quote a lot in the past couple of days and it's kind of swimming in my head because I feel like we, to the extent that I could use the communal we, have been asking ourselves the wrong question this year. And the wrong question, I think, was, when will this be over? And when will the COVID cloud be lifted? Where I think the right question should be, how do we live with uncertainty? And how do we hold on to something when we feel like we're standing on very sandy foundations? So I thought to myself a little bit about how each of us can think of the person they would never have met without this crazy year and the experiences we never would have had without this. And, even the time we spent with our children, which is a gift that this year gave us. And I think that I should, tell you that this podcast would never have happened without a lot of thinking during the first wave of coronavirus. So that was a very long-winded way. I remind you that I started this with talking about science fiction. That's a very long-winded way of telling you should read science fiction.
I like that.
And that I'm thankful about, for this podcast.
I'm very touched by that. I think that's a good thought. I love this point about the right answer to the wrong question or the wrong answer to the right question. But I think that's great. It makes me just think of one thought, which is timely for Yom Kippur, which is reading the right word the wrong way. And that is that there was the late Rabbi Hugo Gryn used to say that instead of thinking of the Day of Atonement, we're reading the word wrong. And what it really is saying is the Day of At-One-ment. This is the day we are at one. And, it's just a word, but you look at it very differently. And maybe instead of it being kind of sackcloth and ashes and beating ourselves up, it is a day where we are at one. I have to say, it's one of the reasons why I like the no screens and everything is the feeling that Jews all over the world at the same time are doing this. And your point about 60% of Israelis are fasting, there will be people in South Africa and Argentina and Germany and Russia and London and Tel Aviv and all over the world who at that point are going through something similar. And so the idea of it being a day of at-one-ment, which is the wrong way to read the right word, maybe, or the right way to read the wrong word. I feel that too. And I think our podcast is hopefully part of connecting those people in our own small way. We are really, I can feel the metaphorical kettle boiling while people are thinking, come on, we've got to get to Shul for Kol Nidre. So we should wrap up. And I will say that you can find us, as always, on Instagram at 2Jews, no numbers, just letters. Do subscribe and follow. Rate us if you do that on your podcast apps. Do it even if you don't do it. It all helps as we forge ahead with Unholy.
Yes, and we shall say thank you to Lior Friedman, our executive producer, Rom Atik, Yair Bashan, and Irad Eshel for original music. Jonathan, have an easy fast. I promise before my fast ends 2 hours before yours does, I will not text you my lovely hamburger table, and I will wait for 2 hours until you write me that everything's fine. Gmar Chatima Tova.
Gemar Chatima Tova. I was going to say that actually that is a whole other podcast of how you break your fast. We'll have to do that next time because we will be back in our usual slot on next week on Friday. This was a bit of a special one for Yom Kippur, but next time we can talk all about that and Sukkot. It's going to be, it's sort of chag-tastic. It's festival-tastic part of the year. But yeah, very fast well, be well, and talk to you next time, Yoni.